Today on the Locked On Blues podcast, I continue to break down news coming out surrounding the Matthew Tkachuk trade and the reported Blues offer and all that stuff, because it seems like the details might be a little bit up in the air depending on who you ask in terms of what the Blues actually offered, who was included in the deal, whether or not Matthew Tkachuk to the Blues was ever even a realistic possibility, and more. Plus, in the second half of the episode, Dom Lashisharin, last name difficult to pronounce, released a list of the top 10 worst contracts in the NHL, according to one of his analytic models, and a St. Louis Blues defenseman ended up on that list. So stay tuned to find out who that is and whether or not I agree with that take. Gonna be a busy episode. Make sure you stay tuned. Gonna be a fun one.
You're Locked On Blues, your daily podcast on the St. Louis Blues. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Locked On Blues podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and your number one source for daily Blues content. I'm your host, Josh Hyman, as always, and busy episode for you today. Sort of a transitional episode, not a ton of news, like I said. A few more tidbits have come out about the Matthew Tkachuk trade, so I'll be giving my thoughts on that. Plus, like I said, talking about certain Blues defensemen and whether or not his contract is one of the worst in the entire NHL. But before I get into any of that, I want to thank anyone out there who has made Locked On Blues your first listen, because we're free and available on all podcast platforms. Appreciate anyone out there who's making the show part of your daily routine, or the YouTube videos as well. The YouTube channels are doing really well, and I really appreciate all the support there. If you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, make sure you check it out. Locked On Blues on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel there. Hit the like button, comment, all that fun stuff. You don't want to miss out. You can see my beautiful face every single day. Anyways, so Matthew Tkachuk was traded last Friday. I did talk about it on Monday's episode. I gave a lot of my thoughts here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time, repeating myself by any means or anything like that, but I do want to talk about a few nuances, and sort of just go on a deep dive about why we can't always trust the beat writers to be accurate when it comes to reporting these things, because a lot of people are up in arms with what the Blues reportedly offered, being Vladimir Tarasenko, Marco Scandella, and a first-round pick. However, that might not even be true. And I think a perfect example of not taking what beat writers say at face value is the Vladimir Tarasenko trade request that happened last year. So, obviously last offseason, news broke that Vladimir Tarasenko had requested a trade from the St. Louis Blues. And basically everyone jumped on and said, oh yeah, the trade's going to be happening imminently, going to happen anytime, soon. And we just didn't hear much, didn't get many updates. And there were some conflicting reports that, it was never actually a trade request. It was more so just, if you want to move on from me, you can move on from me, that being Vladimir Tarasenko. But if you have a plan for me, I'd be happy to be here, etc. The fact that he's still a member of the team shows that maybe that trade request initially reported wasn't as imminent as, we thought. And that's sort of a good example of how the media and all these articles can stir up a bit of a false sense of confidence in certain rumors and certain moves. And I think the Matthew Tkachuk trade, unfortunately, was a similar incident. There were a couple tweets that basically said, Matthew Tkachuk has all the power. I fully expect him to be a St. Louis Blue, if not this season, then by next season. And it seems like those reports were true. Matthew Tkachuk did have all the power, and he initially did have the final say in deciding that he wanted to go to Florida. And one of the reasons was because reportedly that the pressure in St. Louis and all that stuff would be, his living up to his father's image, all the fans, basically rooting for this for years. Part of that, or that was part of the reason why he may have chosen Florida over St. Louis. And as unfortunate as it is, it kind of makes sense. He wanted to go somewhere where the pressure wasn't going to be as high. He could, sort of forge his own path, not be living in the shadow of family members and stuff like that. So that makes sense. But though, if that is true, if that really is a reason why he didn't want to come to St. Louis, it goes directly against all the reports that we read that said, oh yeah, this is why he does want to come to St. Louis. So again, with that, this is all leading for me to basically say, the whole reported trade offer of Vladimir Tarasenko, Marco Scandella, and a first-round pick might not have even been true, because according to certain reports, Vladimir Tarasenko was never asked to waive his no-trade clause to Calgary, which means the Blues couldn't have offered him to the Calgary Flames because they didn't have any sort of confidence that he would even, if they got that trade accepted, that he would even waive that no-trade clause, which would mean if they never asked him to waive his no-trade clause, then that report of this is what the Blues offered is completely false. And this isn't me trying to go on and shame Blues beat reporters, for getting stuff wrong. It makes sense. You're not gonna, you don't have a direct line of communication to Doug Armstrong. You're gonna get stuff wrong. You're gonna try to report the facts as best as you can. Sometimes maybe they jump the gun a little bit and it sends fans into a frenzy over something that isn't even true. Yeah, maybe that's the case. But more so, the point of me bringing this up is to say I don't think we can sit here and accuse the Blues of doing this and be disappointed that they offered that, when in reality we have no idea how this trade went down. It sounds like Matthew Tkachuk might have never even have really wanted to go to the St. Louis Blues. He said, quote, that he could see himself playing there, but at the end of the day, it sounds like he had the final say and he chose Florida. So it might not even have been a matter of, oh, the Blues never offered something good enough, or the Blues, they could have had a better offer. Why the heck did they only offer Vladimir Tarasenko and Marco Scandella? The fact of the matter might be that he told them, like, look, if you pull this trade off, go for it. I'll sign with you, but my preference would be to play in Florida. And I don't think he outright, said that he didn't want to play for the Blues and wouldn't be traded there. But I think it might not have just been solely the fact that the Blues didn't match the trade offer. I don't know. I think it's unfortunate. It's disappointing that Matthew Tkachuk isn't a St. Louis Blue, but maybe it wasn't quite as close as we thought is more so the point with that. And that's a disappointing pill to swallow, but it makes sense. Anyways, in the second upcoming segment, I'm going to be reacting to the Athletics list of the top 10 worst contracts in the NHL, including one surprising member of the St. Louis Blues. Well, maybe not so surprising for some of y'all, but still, lots to talk about. Make sure you stay tuned to that. But before I get into that, I want to tell you guys about BetOnline. Now, betonline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the number one online source for odds, lines, and games. You can find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. I'll be right back with the second half of today's episode. All right, so Dom L. I'm just going to call him Dom L. Because I'm not going to be pronouncing his last name 14 different times in this episode, because I'm just going to make a fool out of myself. But there was a tweet published by the Athletic NHL on Twitter where Dom came up with I don't know if he came up with, but used a model that took contracts based off of how much they're paying the players versus how much they produce in value, and came up with a model that basically assigned a positive or negative dollar value to players based off of how much they are making. And based off of that list, here are his 10 worst contracts in the NHL. There is going to be a blue on that list about, whatever. I'm going to go through the whole list. Going to be giving my thoughts on a couple of the players, whether or not I agree. And then after that, focusing on the Blues player that ends up on the list. But I don't want to keep teasing you guys. I'm just going to read the name. So at the 10th spot, 10th worst contract in the NHL, Ben Sherratt. Sure, fine. Number 9, Nick Suzuki. Now, here's an interesting one. He himself, in the article, Dom said he hopes to be proven wrong on this one. And this is why I don't think we should take this list at complete face value, because the model does basically say, or the model goes against someone in Nick Suzuki's case who got a contract extension, maybe hasn't quite produced at that value yet, but based on his youth and based on his progression, it is more than likely that he will become a positive value for the contract. It would be like, if Robert Thomas got his extension a year prior and didn't have the breakout season yet. Technically, because he's only putting up so many points, he isn't worth $8.5 million at that exact instant. But because he's so young and because he's going to progress, that contract will eventually be worth it. So the metric isn't completely accurate. It's a little flawed. I don't think that Nick Suzuki is actually the ninth worst contract in the NHL. But regardless, I digress. Number 8 would be Zach Werenski. Fair enough. Number 7, Erik Karlsson. Again, fair enough. A guy that hasn't really quite returned to form since his injuries. At his time, was a top 3 defenseman in the NHL, top 1 defenseman in the NHL. Signed with San Jose on a huge, massive deal, but hasn't quite been the same since. Hasn't recovered from his injury. Number 6, the 6th worst contract in the NHL, according to this list, is Colton Pereiko. Well, now, we've been critical of Colton Pereiko on this podcast, and a lot of Blues fans are critical of Colton Pereiko. Is he the 6th worst contract in the NHL? Maybe. Let me get through the rest of the list, and then we'll talk about it. Number 5, Darnell Nurse. Again, he's a good defenseman. He is making a ton of money, so I could see that. I could justify that. Number 4, Marc-Edouard Vlasic. Similar to Erik Karlsson. Had his peak, got signed to a big, hefty deal as he declined, and is turned into a bit of an albatross of a contract. Number 3, Jeff Skinner. Now, this Jeff Skinner thing is interesting. If you guys haven't seen Jeff Skinner's stats over the last 4 years, they are so bizarre. 4 years ago, Jeff Skinner was a 40-goal scorer. He signed a big extension after that. The year after that, he scored like 7 goals. And then the year after that, he scored like 8 goals. So he went from like 90 points to 20 points to like 35 points. He had one really good year and then 2 mediocre years. And then last season, I'm pretty sure he was like a 30, 35 goal scorer again. So Jeff Skinner being at 3 is, I think, justifiable. But if he does return to form and he does continue to have, 30 plus goals as his norm, and those 2 back-to-back struggle seasons are outliers, then maybe he gets off that list. Number 2 on the list is Seth Jones, which, haha, Chicago. I mean, I think we all saw that coming the second that he signed the deal. He's a good defenseman. Is he worth the amount that Chicago is paying him? Absolutely not. Is he worth the amount that Chicago is paying him, considering they are not even close to a contending team right now? Also, absolutely not. And then the number 1 player on this list is Tyler Sagan. Tyler Sagan listed as the worst contract in the NHL. I want to look up on the fly how he's performed in the last few seasons, because that sort of jumped out at me as something that doesn't feel too accurate. He did only have 49 points in his most recent season with the Dallas Stars, so maybe that is accurate. 49 points, 50 points in 2019, 2020, and then he only played 3 games in 2020 and 2021. So yeah, he hasn't had above 50 points in 4 seasons. So maybe that is an accurate ranking for Tyler Sagan. I don't know. Is it the worst contract in the NHL? Maybe. Maybe not. I mean, he's still clearly a productive player. He is making a pretty hefty chunk of money. He's making $9.85 million until the 2027-2028 season. So it's definitely debatable that he has the worst contract in the NHL. But anyways, that's not why I wanted to bring up that list. The reason why I wanted to bring up that list, and the reason why you guys are probably reacting to this list right now and wanting me to just get to the point, is the fact that Colton Pereiko was listed as the 6th worst contract in the NHL. Now, Colton Pereiko does have a very, 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 very hefty extension in terms of years. He is signed for the next 8 years at $6.5 million per year. So right off the bat, is Colton Pereiko worth $6.5 million? Right now, I would say yes. Even though he is not even close to the player that he once was, and he was in that Stanley Cup run alongside Jay Bouwmeester, he is still a good defenseman. If you look at, a lot of stats, minutes played, just the basic level stats, he still looks like a good defenseman. The eye test, it's a little frustrating. You definitely feel like he's not playing up to his potential, but he is a good defenseman. He is a top 4 defenseman. He has his moments of struggle, absolutely, but he is probably the best defenseman on the St. Louis Blues at defending the rush. He uses his length and his size to tremendous benefit in terms of breaking up the rush, stopping 2-on-1s, all that sort of stuff. However, the big issue with Colton Pereiko, that's something that a lot of people talk about, I talk about on the show all the time, is that he doesn't have a consistent left defenseman partner. When he had Jay Bouwmeester on his side, he looked like one of the best defensemen in the NHL. When he had Jay Bouwmeester on his side, there was talks of him winning the the Conn Smythe Trophy as the best player on the team when the Blues won the Stanley Cup. That's how good Colton Pereiko was. He was like 1A and 1B with Alex Pietrangelo, creating, a dominant 1-2 punch on the back end. And ever since then, his really most consistent defensive partner is Marco Scandella. And Marco Scandella's all right. He had a really good 10-game stretch with Colton Pereiko as his partner when he first came over. The Blues won 10 straight, and that was great. But other than that, he's been underwhelming. Colton Pereiko spent a little bit of time playing with Nick Leddy, which, in all honesty, is probably the exact type of player Colton Pereiko needs to play alongside to be a good defenseman. He needs someone who can sort of take away some of the offensive capabilities. Like, Colton Pereiko is a great skater. He's a great puck mover. But when he's asked to be this defensive workhorse and then also pass the puck on breakouts and play offense, that's when he really begins to struggle defensively, because he gets a little bit out of position. He tries to do it all because he feels like he's forced to do it all. And that's when he kind of falters defensively. If Colton Pereiko is able to sort of take a step back offensively and rely on his other D partner to sort of be the offensive initiator in terms of the defenseman out there, then Colton Pereiko really shines defensively. And I honestly think we saw flashes of that when he was playing limited minutes with Nick Leddy. And I think a defenseman of Nick Leddy's role is perfect in terms of, helping Colton Pereiko reach his full potential. But I don't know if Nick Leddy is good enough to play first pairing minutes alongside Colton Pereiko. Even though Colton Pereiko was technically on the second pairing, I think if paired with a proper, defenseman that really complements his game, a Jay Bouwmeester type, Colton Pereiko could be the number one defenseman on this team. But for now, the team doesn't do a good job of supporting him in terms of giving him a consistent, solid D partner. And that's definitely a knock on his game as well, that he kind of needs to be sheltered in that sense. But I just don't think the Blues are maximizing him right now, and I hope a full season with this defensive core next year will allow him to get back to that form and, get off that list of worst contracts in the NHL. Anyways, in this third and final segment, I'm going to kind of wrap up everything that I've been talking about on today's episode, so make sure you stay tuned. Be right back. All right, so in this third and final segment, I'm going to kind of just do a quick little rant on the state of the St. Louis Blues defense, because it's a hot topic, especially with not trading for Matthew Tkachuk. A lot of people were like, well, then if you didn't trade for Matthew Tkachuk, why the heck didn't you go out and get a top defenseman? I've said this before, and I'm going to repeat it. I have a lot of faith the Blues are going to be significantly better defensively this season than they were last season, and that isn't just to do with the defenseman that they have. Now, the fact that Nick Leddy is now going to have a full offseason to work with the St. Louis Blues, and a full season to come in and get comfortable with the other defensemen, and Colton Pereiko hopefully has a full season to recover, injury free. He's dealing with a bit of back issues in the past, so he hasn't had a ton of off seasons to fully ramp up. That could be a good one. Torrey Krug getting fully healthy, another big one. Scott Perunovich progressing. All of those are reasons why I think the Blues defense can be a little bit better than it was last year. However, the biggest thing for me, even though the Blues did lose David Perron, they added to their forward core when it comes to defense. They definitely lost a step offensively with their forward core, but I think that they got a lot better defensively with the names that they added to that bottom six. Josh Levo, Nola Shari, Martin Ferk, guys that are in the AHL right now, like Matt Kessel, even Will Bitton. All of those names are guys that are very, very competent defensively as well as offensively, if offensively at all. Nola Shari especially, I think, is going to do wonders for the Blues defense from that forward position. And the reason why I think that this is going to be such a big help is I think Justin Falk and those guys were great. Torrey Krugs of the world were great, but when the Blues really struggled was with that third pairing and when they started getting injury depth, and they would play like their third line, who wasn't as defensive based as it nearly is in the past, along with their third defensive pairing. The Blues really struggled to keep the puck out of their own net. But now you hope that when the Blues have their weakest defenseman out on the ice, they're also going to have their best defensive line, whether that be one anchored by Ryan O'Reilly or one of the two bottom six lines, which I think are going to be very, very solid defensively next season. So I have high hopes. Definitely still disappointed with the way that the defense looks after this offseason. I would have liked to see it be upgraded a lot more, but number one defensemen don't grow on trees. You would have had to give up an arm and a leg, especially with what defensemen we're getting in free agency. So it's going to be a matter of time just to see, how this team looks, what they end up doing. But it's going to be an interesting year. I think the Blues have kind of taken one step forward and two steps back almost in terms of losing Perron, but adding to their bottom six and losing Ville Husso. So there are a lot of variables. Is Binnington going to be a full-time starter? Is the defense going to play better? Is the offense going to have more consistency in the defensive end? Is the offense going to repeat their tremendous scoring depth, having 820 goal scorers? All of those are really what it comes down to when you're thinking about whether or not the Blues are going to have success next season. So only way you're going to find out my reaction to that is by hitting that follow or subscribe button on whatever podcast platform you're listening to me on, because that is all the time I have for y'all today. So make sure you, like I said, follow or subscribe whatever podcast platform. Leave a review if you're feeling so kind. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, like I said, at Locked On Blues. You can follow all of our social accounts, Locked On Blues, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh Hyman NHL. Thank you all so much for listening, and as always, let's go Blues.